¡Da pa' Afganistán!
¿Qué? ¿Negro me estás jodiendo? ¡Que vaya a
¡Afganistán!
¡la puta madre!
Si me quedo acá yo sé que la garcha me explota. Me voy pa' Afganistán, pongo un turbante en mi chota. No puedo ver más culos, tocar teta ni oler concha. Tengo una bomba de tiempo en las pelotas. Me van a meter kilos de arena en el ojete. Se quedó porque le tendré que hacer un pete, un jeque. Me quiere cortar las pelotas con este machete. Si no tiro una bomba soy un sorete. Bananero, bienvenido a Afganistán. Mira pa'l cielo, baja mi huevo, chúpamelo, viólemelo. Pero concha la puta que te parió. Estoy en Afganistán. 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 Me cortó los huevos. Estoy en Afganistán.
Con los terroristas.
They do the Harlem Shake.
Con los terroristas. Ey.
Non voto Fini, comunista non sono stato mai, senza escort in giro lo sai, non ho superpoteri ma tu non hai.
Il nome Alfano, mezza Milano, i miei migliori, coppe e campioni, Pirla e Sardegna, sacco di fregna, i magistrati sono sfigati.
Nella mia villa ci sono tanti letti, uso di notte, di giorno e convegni. Io ho tante amichette che escono con me, se tu ne montai io le do anche a te.
A Bertinotti,
Ti tiro,
le martellate, invece a Prodi,
ti do,
le bastonate. Umberto Bossi,
diverso,
la camomilla e la Daddario.
io me la porto in villa.
Due colpi due colpi
Non voto Fini, comunista non sono stato mai, senza escort in giro lo sai, non ho superpoteri ma tu non hai.
Il lodo Alfano, mezza Milano, i
Cologno,
miei migliori,
sì,
coppe e campioni,
Forza Mira,
Pirla e Sardegna,
Maccherio,
sacco di fregna, i magistrati
di Milano.
sono sfigati.
I politici incapaci, c'è Passi, è il cretin, Buttiglione è un buffone, Di Pietro faccio tototta, Franceschini e a Casini, io gli dico mi consente come fanno a stare loro al governo e alla Gelmini. Gli regalo 2 o 3 orecchini, io gli compro cioccolatini.
due colpi due.
Spending. I spending more money. Spending on spending to spending. I've been spending. We spend. Spend a little more. Spending. A lot. Spending money on out of control government spending. Spending. Spend on spending. We spending money. Spent. I've been spending money was spent. Spend. We spent too much to spend. Spend a little more. Spending so much. Spending a lot. Spend that money. Spending. Spend. I spend our tax dollars. We spent $1 trillion at war. To spending money. Spending. That's money I can spend somewhere else. Spending money to be spent on spending. Spending money, spend it quickly. Spend too much spending. Spend our money on spending. The spending issue. Spending those dollars, spend money to spend it. Money was spent. Spending. Government spending. We're spending. Spent millions of dollars to spend. Spend more. Spending. I spent a lot. I was willing to spend. Spending. The money has been spent on spending again. Spend more and more spending and spend. I'm spending, spend to spend. I'd like to spend. It's trying to win some money. To spend, spending. We're going to have to spend money on. Spend unlimited money. Spend unlimited amounts of money. Spending money. Limitless spending and spending. To spend. We spend spending. Did I spend spending? Spend more. Did I spend spending? Spending millions. Spent a lot of money. Spend more. I spend money on spending. And spending. To spend. Government spending's out of control. So we had to spend that. To spend. Spending. Spend. Spending a lot. Spend on spending. To spend. I spend a couple $1 million. Spend that money. Spend. I want to spend government spending. I want to spend that money. Spend millions of dollars and to spend more dollars that we're spending right now. We've got money to spend. Spending money. Spend some money. Spending some money. Spend the money to spend on spending. To spending. Government spends more. Our government was spending your tax dollars. Spend. That's a lot of money. Spend. Spending. We need to spend. Spend a lot. Spends a huge amount of spending. To spending, and bank bailout, spent blob of spending, tax and spend, spending. I spend. I want to spend a bunch. Spending on spending, spend the money, spend. Spending out of control to spend without limit. Spend on my watch. Most of the money we spent on the banks. As a result, millions of Americans had more to spend on gas, to spend millions on corporate spending. Spending at usaspending.gov. Spending millions of dollars. Spending on spending. Spending a whole bunch of money. Spending on spending. Public dollars are spent. Spend. Be happy to get this money. We need to spend that money. Spending. That money can be better spent. Spending money. Spend a lot. Spending money. We spend on spending more spending. Spending to spend. I spent most of my time talking about spending money. Spending. Crazy spending in Washington. All this money was spent. Obama, he's a spendthrift. Obama's just spending crazy. Look at these huge trillion-dollar deficits. Big spending Obama.